kind of. Like we need better appreciation of how the vessels work and network and blood. So, where do we start? Okay, so we'll talk about blood vessels in general, their structure and how they work and what they do. I mean, we know it carries blood, right? Most of the blood vessels. So there's essentially 5 types. So you have arteries, you have arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And they're one continuous thing. Like, you're coming from the heart, you're pumping blood from the heart. It's going to go into giant arteries. Okay, and then you're getting smaller, and they become arterioles. And then at the organ level, where there's going to be exchange for blood gases and nutrients and waste, that's where the capillaries are. Then they start to get bigger again, and they become venules. And then they get a little bigger, and they become veins. And those go back to the heart. That's how the circulation thing works. And I've got a few pictures farther down here. Okay, so here. So you have an artery, bringing an arteriole, then a capillary bed, really small, but a lot more of them. And then a venule, and it comes up to a vein. It's all connected to the heart, basically. That's kind of the overall view of how the circulatory system is set up. Okay. So we talked about how much blood there is in the human body and all that stuff last time. Interesting to note that veins contain about 65 to 70% of your blood. So most of it is in the veins. Okay? They generally tend to be a little more relaxed vessels. They can hold more, they can expand. Not very much pressure on them either. Okay. And a large amount of blood in the gut, in the spleen, liver. Okay, that's where a lot of your blood's concentrated. Okay, so let's start with arteries. Alright, so those are the guys carrying blood away from the heart. That's kind of the definition of an artery. If it's carrying blood away from the heart, it's an artery. Okay, so there's 3 layers of tissue. And it surrounds what's called the lumen. That's like a hollow space in the middle, part where the blood flows, like a tube, right? So the middle is the lumen. So there's an inner, middle, and outer layer. The inner layer has an endothelium, simple squamous cells. So a single layer on the inside, okay, of cells. So our simple squamous, single layer, right? There's basement membrane and elastic tissue as well. And then the middle layer, you have smooth muscle and elastic tissue. Smooth muscle is pretty important because when you have sympathetic nerve innervation, it innervates those smooth muscles and causes them to contract. And then that lumen gets smaller. And then pressure goes up in that area. Okay, that's physics stuff. But once that, sympathetic nervous system pressure going up in the outer, And the outer layer is elastic collagen fibers, nothing too crazy. Okay. So remember the sympathetic, parasympathetic, right? Sympathetic is fight or flight, not rest or digest like parasympathetic. Okay. Let's see. So large arteries are known as elastic arteries, like the aorta coming off your heart. Okay, so it's a bit tough to see, but behind the lungs, coming off the heart, there's this aorta coming off. Okay, that carries pretty much all the blood away from the heart, and it has to be super elastic because of all the pressure. Pressure from the heart pumping, right? So you can have a huge burst of blood going into the aorta, and then it's going to disperse out to different arteries, okay, and then eventually to arterioles. So the big ones like the aorta are known as elastic arteries, so they can expand. They can absorb that pressure. That some other if it couldn't expand, then you have all that pressure there. It's going to beat up on that artery pretty badly, cause damage to it. So there's medium arteries as well. They're known as muscular arteries. Examples of that are the brachial and radial arteries in the arm. And we'll talk about all the different names of different arteries, all the important ones. Okay, so here's kind of just a visual of what an artery looks like on this side, okay, versus a vein on this side. So arteries, we talked about all the different layers pretty much, You don't need to know them in depth, just know them from the slide before, okay? You don't need to know the name. Like, the internal area is called the tunica interna, and there's tunica media and tunica externa, but don't worry about that, okay? So there's no arteriole here, so there's artery, vein, and capillary, but arterioles are smaller than arteries. They're almost microscopic actually. Very, very hard to see them. It's pretty much impossible. Like if you have like a cut open person or something, you can't really tell what's an arteriole. But they just have a thin layer of endothelium and a small bit of smooth muscle on them. So there's not much control over arterioles as there is over arteries, okay, from the autonomic nervous system, sympathetics. Interesting to note here, the veins, and we'll get to veins in a minute, but their inner layer has it kind of folds out into the lumen, and that creates little valves, okay? So these valves make it to where blood can't go back the other way, okay? So you have blood going through artery, arterial, through capillary bed at an organ, then it's going to go to venules in the veins and back to the heart. Well, remember how I was saying that in veins there's low pressure and they can expand quite a bit and they can hold a lot of blood. And since there's low pressure there, like say you have your leg, right? This guy's leg, you have blood coming back up to the heart. Well, it has to fight against gravity to get back up, right? And we talked about, I think it was in muscle, even in the last lecture, that moving your legs and stuff like that pushes blood along up, back to the heart. Because there's not enough pressure there to push the blood from your legs all the way up to your heart. So you have to have these kind of these valves, that way blood gets stuck there and doesn't go back down farther and cool in your legs, okay? So it'll come get stuck here a little bit, but then muscle will kind of push it along, a few things will push it along, and eventually it'll make its way up to the heart. But if you didn't have those valves, and they don't, or some people they don't work very well, you have pooling of blood in your veins in your legs. That's why you get varicose veins you see sometimes people have. It's because their valves aren't working right.
How often are the valves placed?
How often? Depends on the vessel. You can see them in a few. We'll do a demonstration during lab where you can see kind of how thin blood pools. But I couldn't tell you how often they're really placed, but they're maybe in a large vein in your leg, maybe a couple inches. I guess I'm not too sure. Okay, so then we talk about capillaries, and they're known as the exchange vessels. Okay, that's where all of the exchange of oxygen, CO2, and nutrients occurs, right? At your organs, because your organs are the ones that need all the nutrients and stuff, right? So that's the reason you have a circulatory system. And they have just a simple layer of endothelium with some basal membrane, and there's a varying degree of permeability depending on the capillary and where they are. So some capillary beds are in some organs that require a lot more oxygen, a lot more nutrients, a lot more exchange. So they'll be a lot more permeable than other organs that don't need as much. Okay. Okay. So what happens at this capillary exchange? So you have these microscopic vessels now, kind of intertwining between different organs, different parts of the organ, over the surface of the heart, in the middle of the heart, all around it. Or somewhere around the small intestines, you have these capillary beds kind of going all around inside. Okay, so they have a really small diameter. You have really slow flow through it, and you want blood to flow slowly through that area because that way you can allow for more exchange. If blood's rushing by, like say you're the organ, right? We're the organ, and there's a big tube that comes through the middle of the plasma, and that's the capillary. Well, if blood comes rushing through there, we're not going to be able to get off our CO2 waste and take back oxygen very efficiently, right? It's going to have to go nice and slow. Okay, it's kind of like if you're sitting in a subway system or a subway tunnel. A train comes. If you come fly really, really fast, you can't get on, right? You have to slow down and almost come to a stop. And that happens because of the small diameter of the capillaries. Okay, and then there's pressure in those capillaries because the heart's pumping, right? It's pushing blood through. So that pressure against the capillary walls allows things to kind of come out of the capillary. Okay, like oxygen and things like that. And then the other way around, there's also a pull on those capillaries, and that's the blood colloid osmotic pressure. There's a difference in concentrations between nutrients and waste and things like that, and so everything wants to even out. We talk about osmosis, right? So things will push and pull between the capillaries, in and out. Okay. Can you visualize that, like at the organ level, these small little capillaries? And in that picture, see here that you think, okay, there's a whole bunch of blood rushing through this big old thing right here, right? That same amount of blood has to come through this. That's why there's a whole bunch of capillaries, just millions of them at every capillary bed. There's just tons and tons. So all this blood can split up into so many different avenues. When you add up all that blood, it should equal still about the same amount as that was in the artery. Okay? It's just flowing a lot slower because there's a lot more roads to travel through. Kind of like Like if you ever go down to like the river or something, and then you know how like the river can be like a rushing, raging river, but if you hike down the river a little bit and it really opens up and it's a lot more wide at some parts, so you can like walk right across it. It's kind of the same principle here, where the capillary beds kind of expand out, and so everything slows down there. It's a lot more calm. But then if you get rapids and stuff, that's kind of usually where there's like a kind of a convergence of the banks, or there's lots of turbulence, lots of rocks and stuff in the way, and that's where it gets all fast and crazy again. You know, in a smaller diameter area. Okay, so veins and venules, again, they're similar to arteries. The inner layers are a little more thin, and they have those valves on the inside, right? The inner layers fold inward. Again, lower pressure, like we talked about already. And then there's 3 ways that you get blood to go from your veins back to your heart. There's contraction of the heart, which is kind of pushing along. There's some pressure. Okay, the skeletal muscle pump we've talked about. When you're walking, you're moving, all the muscles are situated. You know, veins are situated inside of and around muscles and things like that. And so those contractions of your muscles moving will push along blood even more. Then there's what's called the respiratory pump. When you breathe, and we'll talk about this in respiratory system. You have your diaphragm, right? Everyone has a diaphragm for the most part. So when you breathe, your diaphragm comes down, and it creates negative pressure inside your thoracic cavity, and your lungs expand. Okay, that negative pressure in there, remember the veins and stuff are still kind of flowing through there as well, so that will pull along more blood towards your heart as well. It won't pull it the other way because there's the valves right here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so flowing of blood through the vessels. Just generally speaking, you go from high pressure to low pressure. So, you know, when you have blood coming out of your aorta, from your left ventricle, you have high pressure there. Okay, it's going to push, it's going to force the heart. When we talk about the heart, we'll learn how it contracts and just shoots blood out. So it's going to go high pressure to low pressure. And that's kind of how pressures work, anyways, right? You have contraction and relaxation of the heart. Okay, when the heart's contracting, it's systole, and when it's relaxing, it's diastole. Okay, those are the names for it. So you have the systolic over diastolic pressure. Okay. Does anybody know what the ideal standardized, what the pressure we always want to see is? Numbers? Anything?
120 over 90s.
120, generally 120 over 80. This is like your standard goal, which you would want to see someone with. And so that's going to be measured. Where do you measure blood pressure? Like, what do you measure? Do you measure a vein, a capillary, artery, arterial? Because all those pressures are going to be different, right? Because remember, you start with arteries, and it goes all the way to veins, though, right? So you can only pretty much measure on arteries. Since veins are very low pressure, you can't pick it up on that. And venules and arterioles are almost microscopic. There's no way. So arteries are where you get your pressure from. Okay. And there's a lot of things that will kind of dictate pressure, and we'll talk about those as we go. But something like one of the ones that's big is total blood volume. How much blood volume you have. Someone who's dehydrated is going to have lower blood pressure. You're going to rehydrate them, get more fluids into them, more fluid into your vessels, into your system. Okay. So important thing here, systolic over diastolic, 120 over 80 is what you're kind of going for. And here's where we can kind of look at that. Okay, so you have a chart here. It's going to talk about each the aorta, which is right connected to the heart. Okay, it comes right off of the heart from the inside. We'll talk about that during the heart section. The aorta is the big guy coming right off the heart. It's like the vein artery. So your aorta, then your arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. Okay, and vena cava is that's kind of vena cava is where the blood flows back into the heart. Okay, so that's going to be super simple. So basically, right when blood is pumped out of the heart, remember it's high pressure, right? The pump pumps and it squeezes all the blood out. It's like you take if you take a balloon, you fill it like a water balloon, right? And then you kind of pop a little hole in it and you squeeze it. You know, kind of a gush of water that comes out first, and then it slows down and then eventually falls on the ground, right? So that's kind of like how the heart works. It just squirts out blood. So it's going to be high pressure there, okay? And we're measuring two different things here. The top line is going to be systolic pressure. In all these different things, we can take pressure. Systolic is when it's contracting, right? When there's a force. Diastolic is when the heart's relaxing and opening back up, okay? So which of those is going to have a higher pressure? Systolic, right? Crushing force on the heart walls, and it's going to shoot the blood out. And then it has to relax and open up again, so more blood can fill in there, so it can do the same thing over again. So we're measuring two different things, okay? So systolic pressure, when the heart's contracting at the aorta and the arteries as well, like you feel in the arteries, that pressure is around 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay? When the heart is relaxing at the same places, it's going to drop down to about 80. So it's still pretty high. It's still a high pressure with respect to everything else. Arterials, it's a little lower. We can't measure it ourselves. They probably use some sort of, I don't know how they come up with this, but as you go down to the capillaries, you can see here, it's like pretty much just low, and they merge too. So towards the capillaries, the veins, the venules, the pressure doesn't have that pulse. You don't have a pulse. You don't have a bounding change. It's pretty much just constant, and it's really, really low in the veins. It's like closer to 0, 5, 10 maybe even in some parts. Okay, so not much pressure at all compared to when you have the arteries, who have 120 millimeters of mercury pressure, and then a low of 80. So they can. That's why it's called a pulse, because there's a difference. You feel that boom, boom, that throbbing. It's because there's a high pressure there, but that pressure changes from 120 to 80, 120 to 80, and it stays there. Whereas in the veins, manuals, it doesn't. It's constant. You couldn't measure pressure there. You couldn't measure a pulse. Or you can measure a pressure, you can't measure a pulse because there's not any change. Both those lines, systolic and diastolic, merge. So you can see maybe you'd be able to get some change there. That would be close to arterials, but again, we can't measure those because they're small. Does that make sense? So where are we measuring blood pressure? Arteries. Okay. And more than just one. Okay. I mean, we'll talk about a bunch of different ones. You probably see people doing this. Check their pulse. Check the pulse here. Check the pulse here. Check the pulse in the inner thigh. Lots of places. Okay. So just a little more about blood flow through vessels. What kind of dictates blood flow through those vessels? The size of the lumen. Okay. So a bigger lumen, you're going to have maybe a little less resistance, or it depends how you think of it. You can have more resistance or less resistance depending on the size of the optimal. But just know that the size of the lumen. Okay. So smaller blood vessels probably have quicker flow through them. Okay, versus bigger ones. And you kind of think of the stream again. When a stream narrows down, water runs faster through it. When it opens up, it runs slower through it. Okay. The size, or the blood viscosity. So how much of that is red blood cells? That thick stuff at the bottom when we centrifuged last week? I know it wasn't perfect, but all the heavy stuff cells at the bottom. So how thick is your blood? Viscosity, kind of the way to measure it is think of like honey, right? Honey's very viscous, right? It's high viscous then, right? If it's really thick and you can't run, versus low viscosity is really runny, right? Okay. So if it's more viscous, it's going to be harder for the blood to flow. So you have really thick blood, you're not flowing as much. Okay. And then the total length of blood vessels. So when you have more vessels to run through, your resistance goes up. So it's harder to go through. Okay. Your pressure goes up in there, right? Your resistance is high, your pressure is high. Because you have more to go through, there's more friction. Okay. So it slows things down. And the theory with people who are obese have higher blood pressure is because for more fat, you have more blood vessels going in, and you're forming more blood vessels all the time. So you have more blood vessels, meaning you have an increased resistance because the total length of those vessels is larger. And so then you have higher pressure inside, therefore giving you a higher blood pressure. Okay, so we have blood pressure, and we've talked about how we want it to be 120 over 80, ideally, right? So there's a lot of ways you can kind of tinker with that. People have higher pressures and lower pressures, and the body's kind of a work in progress all the time. So there's got to be different ways you can control that, right? And there's got to be different things that can go wrong. So pretty much the big guys that play a role in blood pressure control are these up here. These are really important to know. The heart rate, stroke volume, vascular resistance, and blood volume. So heart rate. So if your heart's pumping and causing that pressure of 120 in your arteries, right? If it pumps, how often is it pumping? Because it's going to either maintain that, that pressure, or it can pump more and raise the pressure. It's going to pump a lot more, right? And raise the pressure, or it can pump a lot slower, and that pressure kind of slow down, calms down. It doesn't maintain, 120 over 80. It might be, 100 over 60 or something. So when you're calm, you're relaxed, your blood pressure is lower, right? Your heart rate's not high. But when you're anxious, you're nervous, you're freaking out, your heart's racing and crazy, your blood pressure's going to be high too, right? Because your heart's pumping. And then your arteries are going to be getting a lot more blood in them, right? And they're going to be kind of off the walls, like getting a lot bigger, expanding, and then you'll be able to feel that, measure that pressure is higher. Stroke volume. How much blood is being pumped through the heart in one stroke? So the stroke volume is the amount of blood that your heart pumps out in one pump. Okay, and we'll talk about that during the heart section. But you can imagine how that would affect pressure too. What if you're pumping blood slowly, okay, or at a normal rate, and then all of a sudden you're not expanding all the way, your heart's not opening all the way, it's opening just a little less, but it's still going at the same rate, but it's now just pumping a little bit. The pressure's going to do what? Come down or go up?
Yeah.
Come down, right? Yeah, you're not pushing through, your stroke volume's gone down. Or what if you're at that same rate and then you start to expand all the way, same rate, but you're pumping out a lot more blood, then your pressure's going to go up. So that's how stroke volume can change. So the heart's able to change the amount of blood it pushes through that help regulate blood pressure as well. Vascular resistance, sympathetic nervous system stuff. You can constrict the vessels and shorten the mouth of the river, close it off a little bit, or not the mouth, but shorten the length of the river across, and then you're going to have more pressure, faster flow through your vessels when the sympathetic nervous system innervates with smooth muscles in the middle layer of your arteries. And then blood volume too. You pour more water down the river when they release water from the dams. You pour more in, you're going to have faster flow and higher pressures. But when the rivers are dry, then there's slow flow, low pressures. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So there's the cardiovascular center. I'm not too keen on you guys knowing too much about more brain stuff than you already had to know for this exam. So just know that there's a cardiovascular center in your brainstem. We kind of briefly touched on it. It's at one of the more primitive levels of your brainstem, right early on, after your core. So that's where a lot of your control for your heart rate is going to be, control for your blood pressure, those kind of things. Also, it's just kind of important is to know that there's 3 different types of receptors throughout your body. And those receptors play a role in kind of monitoring as the afferent nerves, pressure. Because your body, yeah, we can control blood pressure, but you have to be able to monitor it to control it, right? You have to know what your pressures are. And these 3 help out quite a bit. So proprioceptors, like in your joints, they can kind of measure movement, and then the more they're moving around, the more of blood flow they're going to require to those areas and other areas too. So like during physical activity, when you're running around, your body can sense that you're moving quite a bit, and so it's going to try to bump the heart rate. And that's because there's proprioceptors in your joints, in your muscles as well. There's baroreceptors that will detect change in pressures. And you have a lot of those in your carotid and your aorta as well, right up in your aortic arch. When it comes off the heart and it kind of turns sideways and comes down, there's a bunch of pressure receptors there. And that's a good place to have them because that's where most of your pressure is generated, right when it comes out of the heart. So those receptors there are able to kind of fire off, when they're being stretched, they're stretch receptors. When they're being stretched, they're firing off, letting the brain know, well, there's plenty of pressure here. When the pressure falls, they're not being stretched as much, and they're not firing off synaptic pulses to the brain. So the brain's like, wait, the baroreceptors aren't firing off that much anymore. Why is that? The pressure must be low then, because the only way they're going to fire off is if they're being stretched. And if they're not being stretched by the pressure, then that must mean the pressure is lower. And then the body will counteract with all those other, these guys here, and try to get that pressure back up. And get those baroreceptors stretching more, or firing off more often, okay? There's also chemoreceptors in the carotid area and the aortic area as well. And they monitor the amount of CO2 and oxygen in your blood. And if those are out of whack, like if you're going into acidosis, then it's going to let the brain know, like, hey, there's way too much CO2 floating around here. Get the pressure up because we need more blood to be circulating so you can have exchange, so you can breathe out that CO2 and take in more oxygen. Okay? So those are really important. There's a test question hidden in here somewhere.
Like what?
Like what?
Like what? What type of test question would you get?
Like a question about like baroreceptors, how they work. So we talked about how they stretch, just a bit of their impulse, okay? So something about...
It's coming up on this, I'm going to be back behind the rest.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's nothing beyond what we talked about. Okay, so then you also have hormonal regulation of blood pressure and flow. And the hormones come back to haunt us a little bit more. Nothing too crazy, okay? We talked about the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. I can't say it's Monday morning. So remember we talked about renin being made at the kidney, right, during the endocrine section? Then you have ACE, then ACE2, or angiotensinogen, then turns into A2 by way of ACE in the lungs, right? And then you have, that stuff goes and it basically causes vasoconstriction, you have higher blood pressures, okay? And then also, it also helps release of aldosterone, and the aldosterone is going to go to the kidneys and say, hey, take up more sodium. And remember, with sodium, when you absorb sodium, you absorb water, because water always follows sodium. And so when that happens, you're absorbing more water. That means you're not peeing it all out. That means you're going to have more, the dams are releasing more. There's more water in your river, okay? So when there's more water in your river, there's higher volume, there's higher pressures. And then we talk about norepinephrine, epinephrine, adrenaline by the adrenal medulla glands, adrenals, right? What happens with that? That causes all the sympathetic nervous system stuff, the fight or flight. So that's going to cause the vasoconstriction in the smooth muscle layers of your arteries, and that'll bring up pressures, okay? And then you have vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, and that is made, remember where's that made again? ADH? Where?
I don't know. It's kind of in your muscles.
ADH was, remember, it's posterior pituitary, right? It's released from the posterior pituitary. It's one of the two that are back there, and it's actually made up in the hypothalamus, but it comes down the neuronal axons into the infundibular stalk to the posterior pituitary. And then what does ADH do? Anybody remember?
Control the amount of water that you're
Yeah. Antidiuretic, antidiuresis. So it's gonna big picture for the sake of this class and for this lecture, antidiuresis. So you're not gonna pee out water. You're gonna keep it. Okay. And what's that going to do to your pressures? Keep it up, right? Because you're not peeing out the water, so you have more water in your system, and you'll keep your pressures, you'll keep your veins and arteries and stuff nice and swollen up. Then there's also atrial natriuretic peptide. That's in your heart. Don't worry about it too much. It senses pressure. You can read about it if you want, but I'm not going to test you on it. Basically, your heart stretches when it's pumping. If it's not stretching that much, it starts to release this stuff. And it also does kind of the same thing to bring up pressures, but you don't have to worry about it too much. Okay, so now we've talked about vessels, how they work, what they're made out of, what the different kinds are. And we should put it into kind of perspective in the body. Where are they? Where are these vessels? Well, you can break it down. There's a bunch of different circulatory routes. They're all connected, mainly systemic, and we'll talk about that. That's basically your heart pumping blood to your whole body, minus the lungs. Okay, so that's the pulmonary system, and it's all still connected, but it kind of subclasses. And there's a hepatic portal, and you'll have some vessels from your gut absorbing all your nutrients, and it goes to the liver. And that's kind of its own little thing too. And we'll talk about that. Fetal, we're not going to worry about right now. It's a hot mess. A lot going on there. Well, we'll talk about that during the pregnancy lecture. But we'll focus on these three. Okay. Okay. So systemic circulation. You have your heart, and kind of disadvantage of not doing heart first is you don't really know heart anatomy too well. But I'll tell you this much: there's 4 different chambers. Okay. There's two atrium and 2 ventricles. Okay. There's right, left, right, left. Okay. Basically, what's going to happen is you're going to have your left ventricle. Okay. The left lower chamber of your heart. That's going to pump all your systemic blood. It's going to pump it to your whole body, okay? Except for the lungs. Okay, the lungs is different. Don't think about the lungs right now. But you'll have this heart here, and the left ventricle is going to pump blood through the aorta, and it's going to go everywhere, all over the place. Okay, into arteries, then into arterioles, then into capillary beds, then into venules, and then veins. Okay, and then when it's in the veins, where does it go after that? It's going to come back to the heart. Okay. It's going to come back to the heart via the right atrium, okay? For all your blood's going to come back in. There'll be 2 different places it's going to pour in from, because there's blood coming from your head and blood coming from everywhere else, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute, where. But so that's how it all comes back. See, it's pumped out of the right ventricle here. It shows it behind there, okay? But that's where it comes up, and it's all your body parts, like everywhere, okay? Even up into your brain area. See, it comes off, splits off, when it comes out of the heart, it comes down the aorta, but it also splits up into your head too, okay? So it comes up to your head and it comes to the rest of your body, and then it all dumps back into your right atrium here, okay? The stuff from your head comes and dumps into the top, the rest of your body stuff comes and dumps in from the bottom side-ish, okay? So then after there, it's going to come into the lower part of the part there on the right side, the ventricle, okay? And then that gets into respiratory stuff. We'll talk about that in a minute. But right now, let's just talk about everything in the head and here, minus the lungs, okay? So here's a better picture. The heart is going to pump blood out of the aorta here, okay? The aorta is going to dip down, but it's also going to split off into all these fancy places too, to come up to your arms and your head, okay? And it dips down, and then it branches off everywhere here too, and all the way down to your legs, okay? Don't worry about the lungs. Notice how the lungs aren't shown here, because lungs kind of look a bit different, right?
So for test land, would there be something on the lab part of the test regarding this, or like for both?
Both. We'll talk about different things in lab now, or lecture now, kind of the main principles and main arteries and stuff, but we'll get a little more detail with the lab. So as far as identification stuff, that would be more of a lab question. There's not too much as far as the lecture goes. I mean, I can't just ask you, oh, what's that vessel on a lecture question. That's too hard. I mean, I can put a picture on there and do that, but again, when some of these get kind of small, pictures aren't really where I would want to go with this vessel stuff. It's going to be more of what we just covered in the lecture before. That would be more for your lecture and stuff. This is probably a little more lab stuff, but regardless, you know it by next week. So basically, I'm going to point off some of these guys, and this is in your book. That's why I asked if you guys could bring your books today, so you can pull it up in your book and see it a little better, because I know this is kind of small. So I'll point off some of these kind of main things to you guys, and then we'll go from there. We'll break down each of them individually. So again, there's the right heart, left heart, okay, atriums and ventricles. Okay, so the right atrium is pumping what? Nothing. It's actually receiving. Left atrium pumps down to the ventricle. Ventricle pumps out to your systemic. Okay, your left ventricle is what's pumping into your systemic system. I don't know if you have any cool heart models here. Well, look at them during lab. You get a better idea of how this works. So now we can kind of talk about all the different areas where these arteries go, because these arteries are all over your body. And since anatomists have nothing to do, they just named every damn one of them something different. We won't go into great detail with it, but we'll talk about the main guys. Okay. So here's the heart. We can't, it's not here, but so there's the aorta that comes off. Okay, remember that's gonna go down then, and there's a few branches here too. Okay, so those branches, because you need blood to come. Your heart's here. You need stuff to spread out to your arms. You need stuff to go up, and then everything else goes down the front. Okay, so that's the aortic arch. Okay, and you can see that thing on the imaging. You can see it in person. Everyone has it. The right or the left ventricle actually kind of. The heart's kind of pivoted on the side. It's not like the heart you see when you make a heart like that. It doesn't look like that. It's off to the side. It's all messed up. So it shoots up first, okay? It shoots all that blood up, and then it comes down and curves and comes down, okay? But over here, you have a bunch of different branches, okay? You have the left subclavian, so go to your left side. Then you have essentially the right subclavian, but it's branched off of the brachiocephalic, what's called there, okay? The brachiocephalic artery turns into the right subclavian artery. And the reason it's kind of different in this side is because of embryology stuff. The way that the heart forms, the big aorta forms, and how it branches off, and different branches die off and stuff. So that's all embryo stuff. Don't worry about it. Just know that they kind of, you have the left subclavian, your clavicle, sub below, right below your clavicle, okay? And then your right subclavian over here, off your brachiocephalic. And those are going to go towards your arms, okay? Branching off here is your right common carotid, and then off to this side you have on its own branch from the aorta is the left common carotid. You can feel your carotids here. And then you have a split again. What's going to happen is you're going to have an external carotid and an internal carotid. And those are going to come over here. You can see here, we'll talk about the head a little bit more. So brachiocephalic and the subclavian, okay, this comes out this way. Right below your clavicle, out this way. Okay, and then you have your common carotid here, okay, and then right here it's going to split external, and then the other one's going to go internal inside. Okay, so know those. You don't need to know. I'm not going to make you do all the heavy head stuff, but there's one for every darn part of your head. Don't worry about it. Okay, I just want you guys to know that part of it. Okay. So then that kind of, and we'll talk about how these branch off here in a second, right here. All right, so because now you have everything going up to the head, but by way of your carotids, okay, and then your subclavian spreading outward. So we've talked about this. Now we're talking about going this way, and then we'll talk about going down. Okay. So you have right here, you have the brachiocephalic trunk, okay, and the left subclavian over on this side, okay, and then the right subclavian here. So let's focus on the right side, okay, because that's what's here. So your right subclavian goes this way, and it turns into the axillary artery. Okay, your axilla area comes right over here, axilla. Okay. And then farther down, about halfway down your biceps muscle, then the brachial artery. Okay, that you can feel the pulse with. And then you have a split here at your elbow. Basically, you have the radial artery and the ulnar artery. Okay, those two split. And then you have the deep palmar arch and the superficial palmar arch. Maybe arch in your palm. Okay, so the name for the most part can kind of give away its location, and that's kind of the idea of anatomy, is to be able to kind of tell where something is. Radial, ulnar, they run along the radial nerve and the ulnar nerve too. Okay? And again, we didn't go into too much detail with those back in the nervous system section because the class is not designed to go into too much crazy detail. But do know these and be able to map them out, kind of. Okay? Draw them out, practice them, use your netter's flashcards and things to be able to point these out. So now we've talked about going up in the head and going sideways. Okay? You have the axillary artery, brachial, splitting into radial and ulnar, and then you have the deep palmar arch in the knee. Okay, and there's other ones that split off there and smaller things here and there, but don't worry about it. Okay, let's go down. Let's see abdomen first, actually. Basically, you have the aorta coming down. All right, it's going to come through the back of your chest wall. Okay. And then it's going to split off a bunch of little intercostal areas right around your ribs. Nothing too crazy there. They supply all the ribs and everything around there. They're not as fun as this stuff. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's skip the stomach because the stomach gets kind of complicated when you come down the backside there. Let's go to the legs. We talked about the arm and we talked about the legs. And then we'll take a look at the stomach and a little more in depth on its own. The abdomen, the abdominal pelvic region. Okay, so basically you have the big old guy come down, the aorta, and then you split into the common iliac artery here. So you can see it's coming here and it's going to split right and left, right there. You have the common iliac artery, okay? All right, that's going to turn into, then you have the internal iliac, okay? And then you have the external iliac as well, all right? Don't worry about the superior gluteal artery. That's going to go to your gluteal region. It's not a big deal to discuss. Basically, then you kind of have common iliac splits into internal, external, okay, and then just follow it down. And you have the femoral artery. That's important to know that, okay, and then you have the popliteal artery, which is going to be in the back side of your knee here, okay, and then it splits to anterior tibial, posterior tibial, and fibular artery, okay. Know those, and those three only. Don't worry about the foot stuff, but except for dorsalis pedis. Okay, and you can feel that pulse on your ankle, okay, right on the inner side there. So again, the aorta comes down, splits to the common iliac. Common iliac splits into internal and external iliac. Okay, see that there? Split. Okay, so this is the venous system. It's basically the same thing, but they're veins. Okay, pretty much. You still have the right internal jugular, the right external jugular, and they follow along the arteries. When arteries are being formed, they send out signals, chemicals, and the veins, when a nerve is forming, it sends out the signals, and the artery forms right along next to it because that provides all its nutrients. And then veins follow suit as well and come along the same path. So you have all three kind of usually put them together. I'm not going to touch on the vein stuff, but it's the same thing. Okay, so that's the systemic circulation. You have the heart, and it shoots up the aorta, stuff goes to the head, stuff goes to the arms, the rest comes down. Okay? And then it all goes into the organs, all the different tissues and things, and returns by way of the venous system. Okay? And it comes back to the venous system, up to the right atrium. Okay, and it's gonna go ahead and dump into the right atrium by way of two things, the superior and inferior vena cava. And those are two openings in the right atrium that are going to be hooked up to that's where they're going to dump into, and then it's going to go to the right ventricle. And, okay, I'll just wait, you guys can look at this. Okay, so then we also have the pulmonary and hepatic circulations. So everything we talked about, there was no blood really going to the lungs. So the lungs are special. Why is that? Anyone think of why the lungs might have their own kind of path?
Because their tissues and they're so complex.
Okay, but why else? Why would we have a separate circulation just for the lungs? Yes?
The lungs drink, they do something with oxygen and CO2.
Yeah, so the lungs are where you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out CO2. So that's where the actual exchange goes on for oxygen and CO2. So the whole idea of blood, essentially, in the big picture, is to be able to bring oxygen to cells, right? And to take away the CO2 waste product from cells. So that should happen in the systemic circulation. But you need to be able to get that oxygen out somewhere, or you need to bring in more of that oxygen, and you need to get rid of more of that CO2. And that's what happens at the lungs. So the heart pretty much balances between, it pushes stuff to the systemic circulation, it receives stuff from the waste product then, and then it takes that waste product and shoots it up to the lungs. What happens in the lungs, we'll talk about in respiratory, is the lungs get all this crappy, CO2 like filled blood. And then it goes and it breathes, right? Or the lungs breathe. And then it gets rid of all that CO2 and brings in more oxygen, and it takes that oxygen and throws it back to the heart. And that comes into the left atrium, and then the heart pumps it out by way of left ventricle to the systemic system again. Does that make sense? So it's the heart and lungs working together. How does that happen? Okay, so basically you have the heart, right? And it's pumping all this good blood to the systemic circulation. Comes back, gets shitty blood into the right atrium. The right atrium dumps it into the right ventricle. The right ventricle then, behind here, it shoots it up into the lungs, the pulmonary trunk. Okay, and that splits right and left. And then there's a huge network of crazy complex, vasculature in the lungs, and that's where all the exchange goes: gas, oxygen, CO2. That all happens there. And then it comes back to the heart by way of the left atrium. Left atrium pushes to the left ventricle, which shoots it to the systemic circulation again. Okay? So you don't need to know pulmonary vasculature really, but just know the pulmonary trunk, and it splits into right and left. Okay? And why is it colored bluish purple here? Why is that?
Because of CO2 level.
It's or more so the lack of oxygen. So that blood coming into the heart on the right side is going to be deoxygenated blood. So it's almost like, it's venous blood then, right? It's still considered technically an artery, okay? The pulmonic trunk has the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery, right? Coming off the trunk. They're called arteries because they're carrying blood away from the heart. But that's the only artery you're really going to find that actually has deoxygenated blood. Because the arteries are always carrying fresh blood, right? From the aorta, it's oxygenated, it's coming down, and all arteries can be nice bright red. But these guys, even though they're carrying blood, even though they're carrying deoxygenated blood, they're still considered an artery because the definition of an artery is carrying blood away from the heart. So that can be kind of confusing. But for the most part, just recognize that you have the right and left split, and it's going to the lungs, it's carrying crappy blood. It's going to come back with good blood, and it's going to end up pouring into the left atrium, ready to go back out in the systemic circulation. Okay, so a portal vein basically is a vein that carries blood from one capillary network to another, and that's pretty much only seen in the gut. Okay, you see it here, and why is that? Okay, so basically you're going to have here, this thing here is called hepatic portal vein. So there's all this stuff coming from the gut, okay? You have all the nutrients being absorbed by the gut. Well, they need to go be processed first before they can't just send it to the heart and be on its way and then to the rest of the body. They have to process all that, all those nutrients and stuff. And they go to the liver, okay, by way of this hepatic portal vein right there, okay? And the hepatic portal vein is actually made up of the splenic and superior mesenteric arteries, okay? So this is actually the venous picture, but the same thing. So there's a superior mesenteric artery here, and it's going to go up and join here. And then there's also a splenic artery, and here it's a vein. I know this is the wrong picture, but they're going to join those two right there. So this guy supplying all these small intestines, and this guy, supplying the spleen, and they're going to form this hepatic portal vein, and it's going to go up here, and it's going to supply the liver with all the nutrients. So it's really an artery, but this is the wrong picture. And it's going to give all the nutrients to the liver, and the liver is going to go and dump all that stuff back towards the heart just through regular venous circulation. And then it'll come back all the way around. And there's a cool little picture in your book here on page 444 if you look at that. So you'll see the splenic vein and the superior mesenteric vein. They go to the hepatic portal vein. And then I said there's arteries that follow along too. And the arteries is the important one. Well, actually, what happens is the veins here are taking up those nutrients. Okay? So this is kind of one of those, I don't know, weird fishy situations. The veins take the nutrients. Okay? And then they take it and they push it to the liver. And you can see in that picture there, you see how the hepatic portal vein merges into the liver, and that goes in the hepatic veins that dump into the inferior vena cava, which is again the right atrium, which is where all the crappy venous blood is, and then from there it gets pumped into the heart, to the abdominal aorta, and then back to systemic circulation. And then by that way, you also have the proper hepatic artery, which you can't see here, but that'll push regular blood into, clean, nice, healthy blood into the liver, and that's where the liver is getting all of its oxygenated blood. But the liver is getting blood from both systems, okay? The venous system, by way of the hepatic portal vein, that's going to get all the gut nutrients, and then regular, proper hepatic artery, which is not shown here, which is the venous picture, and that'll give it all of the nutrients it needs, like oxygen, and stuff like that. So that's just important to know that the liver takes on both venous blood and artery. Good, fresh, rich, red blood. Okay, circulation. We kind of talked about this. So pulses are strongest near the heart, for the most part, right? That's where all the force is at. Radial arteries commonly checked. Okay, and then the medial side of the biceps checked for brachial artery pulse, and then the carotid pulse here. Everyone can do that. Okay, so your pulse rate is generally what your heart rate is. And what's an ideal heart rate?
Between 80 and 120.
That would be no.
No.
For a heart rate, your ideal heart rate is usually between 60 and 100. So it's different than the 80 to 120 is what your arterial pressure is going to be. But your heart rate generally should be between 60 and 100. Most of the time around 75 or so. But if it goes below 60, that's called bradycardia. You have slow pulse. If it's above 100, that's tachycardia. It's classified as tachycardic. So the person's got a high pulse, rapid pulse. Okay. So at rest, you generally have about 75 beats per minute. But that also depends on the person.
If you're a runner, you're going to have a lower.
Oh yeah. I think Lance Armstrong's like resting pulse rate's like somewhere in the 30s or something like that. So if you're an athlete or something, you'll have a lower resting pulse rate than most people will. That's pretty much it. And we'll do this stuff in Wednesday's mini lab. We'll check the actual circulation, things like that, along with blood pressure. And we'll do that. Other than that, that's all circulation stuff. And we'll polish off all of the actual anatomy stuff during the lab too.